You're watching Notepad, and I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. Earlier this week, we saw the World Bank announcing the much-awaited Malaysia Economic Monitor report, and in that particular presentation, they were talking about social protection, widening the social net, talking about the dire consequences that might come out from the COVID situation, and many more. So here to have a more in-depth conversation joining me is, of course, Mr. Richard Record, the lead economist at the World Bank Group. Richard, thanks again for taking the time to speak with us. Let's go through some of the headlines of the report before we jump into other things in this conversation.
Sure, thanks a lot for having me on, Ibrahim. So we've just launched the latest edition of the Malaysia Economic Monitor, and this one is titled Surviving a Storm. And of course, it comes at a particularly challenging time for Malaysia, like many other economies around the world, which are experiencing a recession and economic contraction as a result of the pandemic and the measures that have been taken to flatten the curve. So we describe some of the elements around that, as well as perhaps highlighting some of the policy measures that Malaysia could take both in the short term as well as the medium term to perhaps look to recover from this crisis stronger than before and undertake some of the necessary reforms that will perhaps help build resilience towards the next crisis.
Some of the numbers that jumped out is, of course, the economy is forecasted to contract by 3.1% this year. Another thing that really, shot or took my attention was the contraction of output by a negative 10% in the second quarter. I cannot imagine the third and the fourth quarter is going to be any better in terms of the performance that we're going to see for this year. Are the numbers as dire as it comes, or do you think that there's a silver lining somewhere or some surprises somewhere that can actually beat these kind of poor projections in the near term?
I mean, sure. So, I mean, it goes without saying that Malaysia's economy has been affected by the pandemic, but frankly, of a lot of countries around the world. In fact, this is the largest contraction that we've seen in global growth since the 1930s. And by our estimate, 90% of the world's economies will experience a contraction this year. So Malaysia's, far from alone in that. In our Malaysia Economic Monitor that we just released, we're projecting, as you mentioned, negative 3.1% growth for 2020 as a whole. And that's the deepest contraction that Malaysia's seen since 97-98. We did see a little bit of growth in the first quarter, but we are expecting a pronounced contraction in the second, particularly with declines in exports, investment, weak consumption, and then perhaps a sort of partial recovery in economic activity in the second half of the year as the outbreak eases and as mobility restrictions are gradually lifted, hopefully allowing return to growth by the end of the year and stronger 2021. I would emphasize that assumes that the spread of the pandemic is contained broadly at the global level. Massive fiscal and monetary policy support by measures around the world help contain some of the deeper aspects of the contraction. And even then, and I can't emphasize this enough, the outlook is still clouded by an awful lot of uncertainty, given that there's a lot that we don't know with respect to this pandemic.
But in the report, the World Bank argues that Malaysia does still have strong fundamentals. We do have some form of resilience in trying to weather the storm vis-a-vis other economies. So what would be some of the key factors that we need to think about that we are doing kind of okay first before we jump into the things that we're not doing, okay in?
Sure. No, I mean, Malaysia's economy is definitely resilient, and there are those sort of strong and sound fundamentals are making a difference. What does that mean? Well, it includes diversified economic structure, the fact that Malaysia's economy is well balanced between domestic and external demand, manufacturing and services, commodities, non-commodities. Also, we have a very sound financial system. There's been an effective public health response and a proactive macroeconomic policy response to the crisis. So together, all of these suggest that Malaysia, in our estimation, should be able to ride out the COVID storm better than many other countries around the world. That said, I think there's still plenty of scope to address some of the structural challenges that we think hold Malaysia back. This includes things like raising the level of productivity in the private sector, stimulating competition in areas where it's absent, raising female labor force participation, boosting the quality of human capital, to name a few. And I think, the temptation is to perhaps focus exclusively on the short-term needs of the country going through the crisis, and of course that is absolutely essential. But it's important not to lose sight of the medium-term structural reform agenda as well, because I think steps that can be taken now will help Malaysia emerge stronger and perhaps recover faster from the crisis afterwards.
And that's the main crux of the conversation, because the longer term items that you speak of, including diversifying our economy, increasing female participation, all that, it's always there and it has been there for quite some time now. Do you think that now is the time for us to get this up and running despite the short-term challenges? What better time to make changes other than the fact that we're already contracting 3.1%, might as well introduce these kind of fundamental changes right now? Is that the case that can be made under the current situation?
No, absolutely. I mean, and these are the types of reforms that would deliver, an economic payoff at any time. But frankly, this is the time where that payoff is most needed.
Okay, let's move into the crux of the report. The report argues that there is a possibility for Malaysia to enhance our social protection, including that of the people that requires the minimum protection of the COVID impact. And the number that is being touted right now is that about 40% of the labor force market kind of need that kind of protection. Let's discuss that in detail. What would be some of the ideas that World Bank has when it comes to social protection in Malaysia?
Sure. So, I mean, we believe, as I think many do, that now is the time to rethink Malaysia's social protection system and really make it fit for purpose for the future. And I think this crisis has perhaps emphasized the importance of having a strong system that provides minimum protection to all Malaysians in need, particularly in the presence of extreme shocks like what we're seeing right now. But I think the crisis has also highlighted that Malaysia's social protection system is not yet able to provide this type of protection. I think the coverage of non-contributory programs like BSH is high, but the level of benefits is generally not really enough to make a difference in living standards or poverty, especially when you compare with other sort of comparator economies. And if you sort of add things up in an aggregate sense, at about 1% of GDP, spending on social assistance is also pretty low by international standards. And then, if you look at participation in retirement savings institutions like EPF and QOP, it's far from complete. There's a lot of exclusions, particularly among the B40 and women. And even those who do contribute, many of them will perhaps receive very low benefits in retirement. So if you have all of this going on, changing nature of work, increase in self-employment, gig economy type jobs, you see a system that really needs to sort of move and adapt, not just for what Malaysia needs now, but as well as what Malaysia will need even more so in the future. So, in terms of what can be done, we think perhaps focus in the short term will be necessarily to support the COVID-19 recovery. We think, continued cash transfers to the B40 will be an important part of that. They do really mitigate acute financial strains, particularly those who are vulnerable households. And they also support recovery efforts by supporting consumption, human capital formation during an economic downturn. We also think it's worthwhile considering channeling further rounds of transfers to the BSH program, perhaps rather than the wider group, particularly those who are most needed support.
All right, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll discuss more with Richard Record of the World Bank. Don't go anywhere. Thanks for staying on with us. I have with me Richard Record of the World Bank talking about the Malaysian Economic Monitor, the latest economic outlook report that the World Bank has published on June 25th. In it, it shows that, well, it's projected that the World Bank thinks that our economy is going to contract by 3.1%, and the numbers aren't that far off when it comes to the first and second quarter reports. We've seen some estimates coming in from other research houses talking about the same thing, and the numbers are actually quite dire. But there are some silver lining that lies ahead. One of them is, of course, increasing social protection, something that we need to talk about again and again, and perhaps now is the time to execute it. So, Richard, before we went into the break, you were talking about increasing social protection in terms of the quantum of it. What about the breadth of it? Do you think that it's not just about the number of BSH items that is being given out, Prihatin and Penjana and all the other stuff, is actually making more people accessible to that kind of financial assistance? Is the breadth more important as well as the depth of these social protection aid that we talk about?
No, I mean, absolutely. And if you look already, what we're seeing in the economy is that, the nature of work is changing, and Malaysia's population is also aging quite rapidly. And so this is seeing a growing amount of job displacement and a growing prevalence of forms of jobs that don't involve what we would call the sort of standard types of employment relationships. So that's what many people call the gig economy or own account work. And then, looking at in terms of the aging dynamics, we think that the proportion of population aged over 65 is going to double from around 7% to 14% within the next 20 or so years. So this is putting a lot of pressure on the existing system, particularly since many of the components have been based on the more traditional or standard types of employment relationships. So, I mean, our view, and I think many would share that, is now is really the time to think of building a framework which is more responsive to these sort of new types of working arrangements. And ideally one which provides a guaranteed minimum level of protection to those who need it, regardless of their sort of specific work arrangements.
One of the arguments that is being put forward in the report is, of course, talking about investments as well. And there is a contraction of investments. In fact, if I can quote the report, aggregate investment contracted for the 5th consecutive quarter, declines in both private and public investment. Do you think that this declining trend will continue, at least in the form of the investments coming in for both the private and public sectors?
So, I mean, investment was already on a declining trend on both sides, public and private, even before the crisis. So if you kind of rewind to pre-COVID, we were talking about, US-China trade tensions, a lot of uncertainty that was putting pressure on private investment, particularly in the sorts of export-oriented activities that Malaysia and many other economies around the region were engaged in. And then on the public investment side, of course, there were concerns about Malaysia's debt, contingent liabilities, and sort of efforts to rein that in. So there was a sort of multi-quarter trend on both sides of weakness or declines in investment. Now we sort of go into the crisis, and that's kind of accelerated that. I think that the sort of challenge here is to kind of look beyond the crisis. I mean, as I mentioned before, Malaysia's fundamentals still remain very strong. Malaysia has a lot of advantages to trade in a region which is structurally growing very quickly and provides a lot of opportunities. I think that perhaps the focus now is trying to address some of those structural barriers that have perhaps limited some of the types and particularly the higher quality of investment that we know Malaysia really needs. So perhaps trying to find areas to boost quality of human capital, the availability of skills, looking at competition and restrictions in some parts of the economy, and measures that can really make sort of Malaysia continue to be an attractive investment destination for both domestic and foreign investors.
What do you think about the policies that are being put in place? Do you think that Malaysia needs to do more? Do you think that Malaysia has what it takes to execute or implement these kind of policies that are favorable towards these investors, the same things that you mentioned just now? What do you think is the capacity for Malaysia to execute it? Do you think that we can actually do it?
No, sure. I mean, and Malaysia has a great track record in this regard. The challenge, of course, is that the competition is getting tougher and tougher. I think, and when investors look at Malaysia, they kind of see Singapore on one end of the scale and Vietnam on the other. And the challenge is to sort of continue to improve Malaysia's offering, to ensure that the skill set of the workforce continues to improve, that the infrastructure and the sort of competitive environment continues to improve, and that public policy is responsive to the needs of the private sector, particularly in attracting that sort of higher quality of investment and job creation that's really needed. So I think the ingredients are all there. The challenge is to sort of keep on moving forward.
Country risk is also something that I can talk about. Do you think that there is an increased political risk, at least for Malaysia?
I mean, I guess there's increased uncertainty in the eyes of investors given sort of political transitions that have occurred in Malaysia. But frankly, this is the reality of democracies around the world. Governments change, and the private sector sort of has to get used to and adapt to that. So I wouldn't sort of highlight risk as being a particular challenge right now. Again, I would sort of perhaps emphasize those structural medium-term challenges around human capital, skills, productivity, and technology. Those are going to be the issues that really drive Malaysia forward over the medium term.
Okay, and any other type of risk that you think is something that we need to talk about other than the political risk I mentioned just now?
I mean, of course, the big risk is we really don't know how long this pandemic is going to last. Will there be a second wave? How will governments, including Malaysia's, respond if there's a second round, or if it takes longer than expected for external demand to recover? that puts a much higher degree of sort of uncertainty into economic policy making than we've experienced for quite a long time. And I think it's going to require a lot of sort of course corrections and responsiveness in policy making that's perhaps than we've been used to, frankly, in the last few years.
And because of this, Malaysia is not spared from the COVID risk, but so are other countries. No one country can say that they are immune to this. Maybe New Zealand, I don't know. But generally speaking, we need trade now more than ever, but the appetite to do trade right now is actually not that great because of the risk that is present amongst the countries that we trade with. Countries like Singapore, China, US, those are the top trading partners of Malaysia. They are in a far worse position than we are, at least when it comes to COVID. Do you think that the trade situation is going to be problematic moving forward?
I mean, it's certainly challenging, but and that's just the reality of being an open economy. Malaysia trades well over 100% of GDP, but there's resilience in that Malaysia trades with a lot of trading partners, has a sort of diversified network of partners of goods and services and products. So I think it's inevitable that we'll feel it here when demand from the rest of the world is affected by a shock. But I mean, that said, we would really strongly argue that this isn't the time to turn away from international trade and integration. In fact, there are even opportunities in the crisis. I mean, just to give you one example, Malaysia has a very special role manufacturing around 2/3 of the global demand for sterile medical gloves. That's an essential part of personal protection equipment, which is needed in the fight against COVID-19. I mean, it's our belief that it's really important to stay the course on an open trade strategy and perhaps, again, maybe even intensify efforts towards regional integration, looking towards a rapid conclusion of the RCEP negotiations, maybe even looking again at CPTPP as well as other trade integration options. And continue that sort of eyeing that longer-term transition to high-income developed country status and some of these medium-term challenges around skills, quality of investments, technology adoption, and competitiveness in the economy.
One thing that we want to talk about is, of course, the export of goods and services. And we've seen the export of goods and services, and as per mentioned in the report, recorded its largest decline since the 2009 financial crisis. This doesn't look too good when it comes to recording for this year's numbers as well. Do you think that this whole export of goods situation is going to be problematic in the years to come? Because we might not be able to come back in terms of the lofty numbers that we've seen in previous years?
I mean, I think we're optimistic over the medium term. Of course, it's inevitable if that many countries around the world are experiencing contractions in demand, that it's always going to be tougher for economies like Malaysia that export intensively. But over the longer term, we've seen consistently that trade grows faster than GDP growth around the world. We've seen the benefits of international integration, of specialization, of the development of global value chains. These sort of changes in the way that the global economy works provide fundamental benefits, and Malaysia is a great example of a country that has benefited from that process. Of course, the challenge is right now associated with this pandemic, but eventually it will pass, and we'll see in all likelihood a return to economic growth, return to global integration, and I think Malaysia has benefited from that process and will benefit from it again.
Okay, we'll take one more break before we discuss a little bit more. This time around, we'll be a little bit more on the GDP itself. Don't go anywhere. Thanks for staying on with us. We are talking with the World Bank right now. Richard, we want to slice and dice a little bit about the Malaysian numbers. We've seen that normally manufacturing and services sector contribute a lot, and the other sectors, including agriculture, construction, mining, have all been contracting. It's nothing new, but one thing that is new, at least for the first quarter numbers, is that the services numbers are actually shrinking quite substantially, and we can understand this happening because of the retail space, the consumer space, traveling, and also the tourism space. They're all gone, at least for the second quarter. Does this provide an opportunity for Malaysia to actually really think about whether making big bets on services might be a poor idea, or do you think that it's still a good idea for us to double down being a servicing based country? but at the same time, we really need to look at manufacturing in all the other sectors as well, because the need to diversify is really important following the COVID lessons that we've learned in the past few months.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the structure of Malaysia's economy, over the longer term, you see a process which many other countries have gone through too. This is the long-term sort of economic development process from agriculture, usually into sort of manufacturing, and then eventually into services. I'd say actually Malaysia's economy is quite well balanced at the moment. It's been helpful. Manufacturing is important, but it is also vulnerable to sort of slowdowns and economic shocks like we've seen at the present time. The services sector, reflects progressive efforts over the last decades to increase productivity and automation in the manufacturing sector. So I don't think we can kind of sort of push against gravity there. Inevitably, as Malaysia eventually becomes a high-income developed economy, the share of the population working in manufacturing will be smaller. I mean, you look at advanced economies around the world, and even the ones who manufacture incredibly intensively, that share is smaller. So I don't think we can sort of push against those trends. The challenge is to ensure that all parts of the economy are competitive. There are elements that aren't necessarily shielded too much from competition, and some of the dynamics that allow for sort of productivity growth and the creation of higher quality jobs to continue over time.
Interest rates have been pushed down, and not just in Malaysia. A lot of countries are doing that as well. Inflation rate is also low at 0.9%. These numbers are actually interesting to discuss, because when we talk about economic growth, it's times like this that we can look at cheaper source of funding and cheaper way for us to deploy capital. Is this a good time for us to really think about how we can restructure our financial situation right now?
Yeah, I mean, but these interest rates and inflation have been very much responsive to policy decisions and changes that have been made over the last few years. I mean, on the interest rate side, that's been one big part of the monetary policy response and the financial sector policy response to sort of protect liquidity in Malaysia's economy and allow firms and the financial sector essentially to sort of hibernate through the process of the crisis by increasing regulatory forbearance, reducing the cost of capital, essentially so that firms can preserve cash flow until they can sort of resume economic activity. So that's a policy that many other countries around the world have been undertaking as well. I mean, inflation, yet frankly, it's primarily a dynamic to a large share in sort of transportation costs. So that's been falling now for several months in a row. So it drags down the headline number. Of course, if you talk to ordinary Malaysians, they will tell you that, well, food prices and other things are still rising, and that's kind of been the dynamic that we've seen over quite a few years now.
Yeah, but people like to complain anyway, so that's like a pastime for us. So.
Yeah, but I mean, you do have to look beyond the headline and the average numbers, though, as well. And when you see different items in the basket and in different parts of Malaysia, they often move in different directions.
Yeah, of course. And finally, let's talk a little bit more about government spending. The government is spending a lot. The higher government spending, as argued by your report, tends to cushion the pandemic's impact, but this cannot go on for long. What would be some of the measures that you think will happen? And perhaps you can consult your crystal ball right now and talk about the idea of the government's motives and movements in the upcoming few months. What do you think the government could do and should do, at least from an economic standpoint?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess the short-term question is, we've had the Prihatin package, the Penjana plan. These are, this has been an economic policy response on a scale which is, consistent with what we see in advanced economies, 19, 20% of GDP. And it certainly helped to blunt the impact of the crisis. That said, we do think perhaps there's some scope to increase the quantum of financial assistance, particularly those and that which is provided to vulnerable households and to ensure the sustainability of SMEs. And the challenge that Malaysia has maybe is that you have falling oil prices and an economy that went into this crisis with rather less fiscal space than would have been desirable. So, relatively high public debt, contingent liabilities, and a sizable deficit already before the crisis. So you couple that, lower oil prices, which affect revenues very dramatically, and then a set of fiscal rules that impose limits on the type of response that the government can deploy, limits on the amount that can be borrowed and what that borrowing can be used for. So it's a little bit of a sort of straitjacket that the government has had to sort of navigate to try and respond quickly and effectively while sticking within these rules. Our sort of suggestion that we presented in this edition of the Malaysia Economic Monitor is not only to sort of put fiscal consolidation temporarily on hold, but to look at amendments to existing legislation on borrowing that might create additional headroom for a deeper response if needed. If, for example, we see a second wave or it takes longer than expected to recover from the crisis. And we do think perhaps there's a greater scope to utilize direct fiscal activities, including transfers to the vulnerable, particularly those in the B40, over a more sustained period of time. That's the short term. When it comes to the medium term, we mentioned before, I mean, there really is no time like a crisis to address some of those deep structural and reform challenges that Malaysia really needs. These were important before the crisis. They're essential right now. And there are large payoffs from increasing the level of female labor force participation, stimulating competition in those parts of the economy that really don't have particularly high level of competition, trying to accelerate the digital agenda, including the digital divide. We know, while in urban areas, Malaysia is among the world's most connected population when it comes to the internet, there are parts of Malaysia where that gap is quite significant as well.
Yeah, of course. Final words before we end this conversation?
So I think this is an unprecedented economic shock, but Malaysia does have natural resilience, and I think there's opportunities in this crisis to perhaps put into place the building blocks for more sustainable growth over the medium term, and a social protection system which will allow Malaysia to weather the next shock better than this one.
Fantastic. It's a pleasure speaking with you. That was Richard Record, the lead economist at the World Bank Group, talking about the Malaysia Economic Monitor, headlined with the title Surviving the Storm. I think you can have access to that. Just search on Google for that particular report. For now, that's it from me. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.